Sounds good. Well, this is Brian Johnson with Finance and Commerce, and I'm pleased to be joined by Craig Johnson and Daniel Lightfoot of the League of Minnesota Cities. And we're here to talk a little bit about, do kind of a postmortem on the 2026 legislative session and talk a little bit about the bonding bill and housing and other issues of interest to cities and to our readers and listeners. So, Craig and Daniel, thank you for joining me. I understand you're recovering from the legislative session now, which concluded Monday. So, thank you for taking some time to chat.
Glad to
Oh,
be here, Brian. Thanks.
yeah, our pleasure.
And I don't know who wants to jump in here first, but I was wondering if someone could just do a brief introduction and talk a little bit about the League of Minnesota Cities and its mission. I believe you represent something like 800 cities across the state with advocacy and education and things of that nature. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. I can jump in and Craig can pick up the pieces if I leave anything out. The League of Minnesota Cities is the state municipal league for the state of Minnesota. We represent 832 member cities out of the 834. Craig is correcting me. 800, no, it's, you know what, it's
842.
842. Thank you. See, Brian, we are catching up on sleep, so you correctly indicated that. 842, thank you, Craig, out of 856. Um, and the league provides a myriad of services to our member cities, including assistance with advocacy at the state capitol and before the congressional delegation and federal agencies. In addition to that, we answer all kinds of questions from cities and staff around the state. And really, our mission is to promote the excellence in local government. And Craig, what did I miss?
I think that covers it. We've been around since 1913. We used to be a part of the state extension service, and then in the 1970s, there became a need for local insurance pool trusts because private insurers would not cover local governments any longer. And so at that point, we separated from the university system and became a standalone entity that has both an insurance pool side and a advocacy and training side on cities.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that overview. And let's just jump right into the legislative session. One thing of interest to the league, I'm sure, and to our readers and listeners is the bonding bill. And as we know, the what we ended up with was a bill of, I think, about $1.2 billion in size, funding projects ranging from wastewater systems to transportation, things of that nature. Tell us about that. Again, whoever wants to jump in, tell us a little bit about that. What's your assessment of what we saw in terms of the bonding bill this year?
Sure, Brian, it's Craig, and I covered a lot of the issues on the bonding bill this year. So just very quickly, yeah, the final bonding bill was about 1.275 billion in bonds and about another 46, 47 million in general fund money to kind of round out the funding on some projects that either weren't eligible for bonding or needed another little bump of money. Um, what I think is probably most notable in this is out of that pot of money, there really were two focuses. One was asset preservation of existing state facilities that need work done to keep them functional and vibrant. And the rest was almost entirely local government infrastructure needs being met. A much higher percentage of the bonding bill went to local government projects than I think has happened in any recent memory for me on any bonding bills that have been passed. So, that amounted to, for instance, for water and wastewater projects across the state, between the pots of money that the state runs through the Public Facilities Authority, a couple of side pots with pollution control and Department of Health, and the Board of Water and Soil Resources. We had close to $500 million of water and wastewater and other water-related project funding out of a 1.25 billion dollar bonding bill. So it's a huge chunk of money that I think really recognizes that these problems aren't going to go away. The longer you delay building and upgrading our water and wastewater systems, some of which are from the 1930s. Uh, the projects just get more expensive and more difficult over time. So I think the legislature tried to take the biggest bite they could out of that backlog this year.
One
And
thing
it's,
I did,
yeah,
yeah.
nope, go ahead.
No, no, in just continuing on the water infrastructure conversation, one thing I saw was that the for removing the old lead pipes
Yep.
was a little bit underwhelming from what was I guess once I think at one point there was a desire for something in the neighborhood of $100 million, and they ended up with 15 million for that, if I'm not mistaken. Tell me about that, and how big of a concern is that for your members?
It is a big concern for our members, Brian. There's a federal requirement that all lead service line connections be removed within a 10-year period, which is already, the clock is ticking on that already since last year. We initially put a good chunk, $240 million of state money into that 2 years ago. That money triggered a whole bunch of federal matching money. However, that pot of money is going to very soon be expended, and the need is for hundreds of millions more to get lead pipes out of all the connections between public water supplies and private residences in Minnesota. The challenge is that that all happens on private property. It's not, they're fixing a pipe that normally the homeowner would be required to pay to fix. And we know people aren't going to be excited about spending 12 to $20,000 to replace a pipe. So we're trying to get state and federal funds to cover that to the maximum extent we can. And so, yeah, there was an ask initially for well over $100 million. We thought that there was a kind of a plan to do $100 million of appropriation bonds so that they would be eligible to be used on projects that general obligation bonds of the state can't be used on, because those can only be used on public property. They can't be used for private property. So we thought that was where it was going to go, but as the final negotiations occurred, other uses were planned for that $100 million, and what they ended up getting is 15 million in general obligation bonds. So those funds really can't go for the connections to your house. They could go for public lead lines that need to be replaced, and then maybe the public's utilities could use some of their money that they were going to use to replace that to use for grants to help homeowners replace the lead pipes that go to their houses. So it'll kind of have to be a little bit of a fund shuffle to get it to work. And it's nowhere near enough money to make a meaningful difference, but at least it keeps a line item in the bonding bill so that when the legislature comes back next year, they won't forget that that's something that has to continue to be worked on.
Hmm. Yeah, and anything else you'd care to talk about? Say, one thing that on the housing front, I know that's always a big issue in cities throughout Minnesota, not just the Twin Cities. What happened on the housing front in the legislature this year?
Yeah, sure, Brian. Daniel Lightfoot here. So the legislature ended up passing a $165 million omnibus finance and policy bill on the housing front. 100 million of that is coming from housing infrastructure bonds, which are appropriations bonds that can help support both federally assisted public housing and private and privately owned housing, qualified privately owned housing as well, both on the ownership and rental side. And then the 65 million portion is divided up in between funding that is being recouped from the state from the Tyler settlement, Hennepin County, and 25 million coming from actually interest earnings from interest earning products that are being offered by the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. So overall, a surprising amount of resource, I would say, in terms of investment. It's a pretty impressive bill considering the financial constraints that the state budget has been facing as of late. And so we were very pleased to see a really strong number in housing infrastructure bonds, which are critical to help support a wide swath of projects and communities across the state. Um, and some additional boost to existing programs that communities take advantage of, namely the Greater Minnesota Workforce Housing Development Program, which focuses on market rate rental housing, and the Manufactured Home Park Infrastructure Grants, which help support resources for private infrastructure that serves manufactured home park communities.
And I guess more on the policy side, there's been a lot of talk in recent years about missing middle
Sure.
housing, zoning reform, things of that nature, reforms to homeowner associations. Um,
Yes.
Wonder if you could address those. I believe the Starter Home Act, I believe is what they called it, and I don't believe it passed this year. But tell me about that and kind of where you stood from the city's perspective
Sure.
on that bill.
So I'll start. You mentioned the homeowners association common interest community piece, which did pass. So I can
Mhm.
touch on that a little bit and then
Sure.
talk a little bit about the Starter Home Act as well. So the HOA Bill of Rights, which is kind of what the bill was commonly referred to, was a sweeping package that addressed a wide swath of issues related to homeowners associations and common interest communities. The bill among other things, seeks to address the governance of HOAs and CICs. It looks at providing caps for certain fees, prohibiting an association from placing a lien on a property due to unpaid fees. It discusses a lot of transparency issues as well as creates an alternative dispute mechanism for residents and among a myriad of other things that are related to individual property owners, unit owners, or homeowners within an HOA or a common interest community and how sort of they operate within the context of the association or the common interest community. Um, the bill also does include a preemptive provision that prohibits a local unit of government, so county, township, or a city, from conditioning the approval of a residential development, building permit, subdivision approval, conditional use permit, et cetera, on the creation of a homeowners association or any private common area that would necessitate a homeowners association unless it was requested by the developer. Oftentimes, we do know that developers do include private common elements within their development that necessitate a homeowners association. Of course, if you're building something that's a common interest community, a condominium, for example, you're required by law to have a common interest community to maintain that private common area. And so it will create kind of a new sort of structure and decision point for communities as they look at residential development approvals and the like. So in addition to that, you mentioned the Starter Home Act. And Brian, you and I have talked about this issue for years, and this is certainly not a uniquely Minnesota issue. There are a number of states that are either currently considering or have already passed aspects of zoning and land use reform bills at state legislatures. This year, we did see, as you mentioned, the Starter Home Act, which was the product of more than 2.5 years of discussions, good faith negotiations between the Yes to Homes Coalition and the League. We believe that while the League doesn't support bills that directly preempt city authority, this iteration of this draft did address a number of substantial concerns. I think we saw some movement in trying to balance the local decision-making authority and local decision-making piece when it comes to what goes where in a city, with meaningful policy reforms that are being pushed by that coalition. And so that bill included somewhat of a pared down versions of aspects that we've seen in legislation in the past. Rather than requiring all 856 cities to upzone 100% of their residential area, that bill included a provision that would just require a subset of cities above 5,000 in population to upzone a third of that residential area. So that's just an example of how I think there's been a lot of movement towards finding that balance between some of those policy reforms, but making sure that those reforms are targeted in a way that makes sense to recognize the differences of housing needs in different communities and certainly in different regions. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense in our opinion and assessment to, require very, very small cities that may only have, one or two FTEs and haven't had a residential development in 25 years to completely overhaul and rewrite their zoning and land use ordinances when they probably won't see, just due to economics, probably won't see a development in the next 25 years, not because of their zoning and land use ordinances, but because nobody's building out there. And so we, ended up taking a different advocacy posture on this piece of legislation this session, because many of our concerns were addressed, though of course the bill was still preemptive, so we aren't able to support a piece of legislation like that. But I want to provide significant kudos to the authors and the stakeholders who continued to work on this bill. I think the outcome of this piece of legislation this session was significantly better in many ways than previous iterations of the bill. And while the bill wasn't included in any omnibus bill and failed in the House in its first committee stop in the House and wasn't brought up again, our hope is that we will continue to be at the table and work on this as the conversations move forward. And if I could, I think our main priority next session and sessions to come is to not sort of reinvent this bill yet again, and to try and build off of the language that we saw this session. Are there some things that could be tweaked? Absolutely. I think that we still want to continue to work on that, but our main priority, kind of thinking about next session, is to ensure that we build on that success and we build on that piece of legislation in a way that helps move some of those conversations forward, rather than sort of erasing the last 5 years of good faith negotiations between the city community and advocates and stakeholders.
Hmm. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that next year and in future sessions. So
I would bet. I would
yeah,
bet that.
yeah. We haven't talked much about transportation in terms of funding for local roads and bridges, things of that nature. Where did the league stand on that, and what was the outcome this year?
Yeah, this is Craig again, and we did not see a lot of attention paid to transportation, either policy or funding this year. There was an attempt right at the end of the session to try and get some non-controversial transportation policy issues adopted, but it was too close to the wire, and it did not make it before they adjourned on Saturday night in the Senate. It got filibustered to death, but it wasn't much of a filibuster. It only took about 3 minutes. Um, as far as finance goes, it just continues to be a place where we do not have adequate funding and have not had a significant infusion of new funding sources in probably decades now. Um, the
Mhm.
bonding bill did include this time, unlike last year's bonding bill, this bonding bill did include local road and bridge funding, but not a ton of it. And a lot of that is already basically assigned to various subpots of money, so it's going to be spread pretty thin across the state. On the upside, it will be spread across the state. So there's a chunk of it that's dedicated to small cities for their street projects. Even townships get a little bit for their roads, and counties, of course, get a chunk for their county highways. And then beyond that, there were a lot of individual projects that got earmarked for specific funding that have been waiting for a long time to try and get funding to do the work, especially if it's a project where it's kind of a required project where the city is required to do a portion of a state or county road upgrade. There was a lot of funding for places where those funds were lacking and needed to be given a boost by state funding. So there was a decent amount of transportation funding in the bonding bill. Let me look real quick here.
Yeah, there were a couple of pots of money for bridges
Yeah, we had the local roads
and local road
improvement and local bridge
improvements.
improvement, and the total transportation section in the bonding bill, cash and trunk highway bonds and general obligation bonds and general fund money all combined was about 181 million dollars.
Yeah.
So, not a small
Which is
number, but
less. Yeah.
not a small number, but a much smaller number
Yeah.
than is necessary.
Yeah.
The
So we will
actual
continue, yeah, we'll continue to have to work on that in the future.
the needs are always greater than the actual funding, so it's just
That's right.
Vastly,
what
yes.
you're
That's
talking
right.
about. We've talked about water infrastructure, housing, transportation, and I don't want to keep you too long here, but is there anything else that you'd like to touch on in terms of not necessarily what came out of the legislative session, but anything else that might be on your plate this year? Just want to give you the last word and
Yeah,
um, on
I'll
that.
I'll take a shot, and Daniel can pick up if I
Sure.
miss something here. But I think one area that there was a ton of demand and actually a lot of legislative support, but it just didn't come together for enough support to pass it in a final legislative package, is as both state and federal funds get more and more difficult to access, and community costs and needs continue to escalate, and the cost of doing things escalates. Cities are desperate to find new revenue sources they can use to finance what needs to be done at the local level, especially as it comes to, significant projects where it would be a big lift for the community to do it on its own. And one way that a number of communities have done that recently is by having specific local sales tax additions that are used to augment the financing packages for these projects. We had over 30 cities that came in and gave presentations to the House and the Senate with uh, and have already had, referendums at their local level to support doing these projects, but none of those were included in any of the final tax language that was passed. So none of those cities will be cleared to move forward with a sales tax financing mechanism for those projects. That is an ongoing issue where a city must come in individually and get approved by the state project by project to do that. And we had hoped that over this year, we might either see a more general system where if a city has done the following things, they don't need to come to the legislature to get individual approval, or a fairly broad legislative approach to we're going to approve you if you meet these three things. It's going to be a little easier for you to get our approval. And neither of those were able to be worked out this session. So none of those were approved this year. I think that's one that we're going to be seeing come back in a big way.
Yeah, I mean, especially, I think there was also kind of against that same backdrop, there was also a pretty significant microscope or magnifying glass, if you will, on just the general nature of property tax levies in communities across the state. And, as we're talking about the resources sort of shrinking for many of the projects infrastructure wise that Craig talked about. Granted, there was a significant amount of resources for individual local projects, but we're seeing sort of the pots of money that were traditionally available in the last 3, 4 years, bolstered by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act at the federal level. We're starting to see those pots kind of dry up. And if we don't have additional mechanisms outside of the property tax levy to help generate resources in a more targeted way for those projects, we're going to continue to see year-over-year levy increases that may be higher in places. And so I think we'll continue to be at the table with whatever legislature we get next session, and the new administration to really highlight that. We need more tools to address those considerations, and without them, our only mechanism is to rely on the property tax base.
And then, Brian, the only other thing I would point out is we're going to be really busy next year.
Hmm.
43 legislators are not seeking reelection to the seat they're in right now out of 201. Now, some of those might end up going from the House to the Senate, but that's without the ones who fail to win reelection. So we could very
Hmm.
easily have close to a third of the legislature as new legislators next year.
Hmm.
And that will be a tremendous lift to get them kind of up to speed on how all of these state and local programs have to interact and what the needs are that are out there. Uh, fact, I just was told by one of our coworkers at an update we gave this morning to some other folks from the Senate Tax Committee this year. The Senate DFL tax chair is retiring, and every Republican member on the committee is retiring.
Hmm.
And two of the Democrats on the committee are in very difficult reelection campaigns. So we could literally just have like two members of the entire Senate Tax Committee that come back, maybe four. But that's going to be a big deal when we have people who have to learn a very complex and important tax structure for the state. And that's going to be true in most other committees too, where there's going to be just a huge infusion of new people. Um, Maybe not the most we've ever had, but in the ballpark of the most we've ever had, where they're going to have to kind of hit the ground running next January and figure out a state budget in a pretty short amount of time.
I was going to say, plus it's the
Yeah.
first year of biennium, so
And
Mhm.
it
that's
is
a new budget.
it's a biennium where we do expect structural imbalance at this point.
Hmm.
So they
Hmm.
will have to find a way to either increase revenue or decrease expenditures significantly.
Hmm.
So I
Wow.
think that's going to be where we're focused going into next year is how do we get to those people? How do we help them understand our concerns in this and make sure that we're at the table as they discuss how they're going to deal with that?
Yeah, some heavy lifting ahead next year, so
You
we'll
betcha.
see we'll see how that goes.
That's
But
job security for political reporters.
That's
right
right, for
on.
both you and us, Brian.
Exactly. Hey, Craig and Daniel, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your perspective. Some great information there, and hope we can chat again soon.
Yeah, thank you for
Anytime,
inviting
Brian.
us,
Thanks.
and we're happy to help out
Yeah,
and let you know what we think.
absolutely. Thanks again, gentlemen. Take care.
Thanks, Brian.